Hello, and greetings from the University of Notre Dame Press. I'm Catherine Pitts, the Marketing and Publicity Director at the Press. We are delighted to be here today with our Books for Better Understanding author event series. Today's featured editor is Kelisha B, whose book, Nannie Helen Burroughs, A Documentary Portrait of an Early Civil Rights Pioneer, 1900 to 1959, will be released in a paperback edition on July 15, 2022. I'd like to start by introducing Dr. Graves. Kelisha Graves holds a doctorate in education from Fayetteville State University. She is the Chief Research, Education, and Programs Officer at the Martin Luther King Jr. Center for Nonviolent Social Change. Her research focuses on the global Africana experience with specific interest in education, intellectual history, and philosophy. In 2019, Dr. Graves edited and annotated the book, Nannie Helen Burroughs, A Documentary Portrait of an Early Civil Rights Pioneer, 1950 to 1959, which was published by the University of Notre Dame Press and which is part of the prestigious African American Intellectual Heritage book series. The book has been widely reviewed and featured in numerous journals and newspapers, including the Journal of American History and the Washington Post. Thank you for agreeing to talk to us about Nannie Helen Burroughs today, Dr. Graves.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, let's jump right in. Your introduction to the book, which is titled God Will Give Us Credit for Trying, Toward an Intellectual History of Nannie Helen Burroughs, provides a comprehensive overview of Burroughs' life and work. Would you like to start by telling us a bit about her life and times? She lived from 1879 to 1961, and why she was lauded as the world's most scintillating Negro woman leader by the Pittsburgh Courier.
Most definitely. So to start, thank you again for having me. Nannie Helen Burroughs was probably one of the most prodigiously gifted thinkers and doers of the 20th century, particularly when you look at African-American history. She was described and ascribed, if you will, the moniker scintillating, precisely because she was able to move people to action, to move people to higher planes of thought, right? She was able to apply her life in such a way that she was able to bring about innovation across a wide variety of spheres, if you will. If we were to talk about her times, she is one who is a daughter of the South. She is the descendant of formerly enslaved heritage. She descends from those who, by virtue of their transport to this terra firma that we call America, were prescribed to the very bottom of society. So her times is an era in which those who look like her have been given a particular designation and are given and prescribed a narrow realm of activity. But her times are also conditioned by thinkers like W.E.B. Du Bois and Marcus Garvey and Booker T. Washington and Anna Julia Cooper and Mary Church Terrell and Robert Terrell and all of Ida B. Wells, T. Thomas Fortune, all of these prodigiously gifted thinkers who are trying to wrestle with the question of what ought to be the destiny of African descended people in this hemisphere, what ought to be the destiny of African descended people in America. And so they're wrestling with this question, and you have those who advocate for deserting this place, for going back to Africa. You have those who are committed to staying here and to working out our destiny, to envisioning new ways of being in this society. And so her times are conditioned by a couple of different forces. But that leads then to the question of, what about her life? And so I described Burroughs as, I described her at one point as a grand mosaic of a woman, one who is full of nuance and brilliance and depth and dimension. And so even though her times are conditioned by Jim Crowism and a lot of these other racial policies and racial designations, she's able to live above that and to apply her life in such a way that she empowers other people like her to do the same. And so Burroughs, again, is just remarkable for her times, to live from the late 19th century on through the middle of the 20th century. Her life encompassed so many different kinds of movements, so many different kinds of people and leaders. Among her friends are those like Carter G. Woodson, the father of Black History Month. She's designated and called, Mrs. Booker T. Washington, almost facetiously. So Burroughs, again, is a remarkable and just prodigiously gifted thinker of the 20th century.
Fascinating. And she did live a long life.
Yeah, she did.
Yes, indeed.
She did.
Your anthology of Burroughs' writings, and the writings were written between 1900 and 1959, encapsulates her work as a theologian, philosopher, activist, educator, intellectual, and evangelist, as well as the myriad of ways that her career resisted definition. She, as you mentioned earlier, she certainly sounds like a polymath and a Renaissance woman. Why has Burroughs been overlooked as a pioneer figure in African-American intellectual history?
Yeah, I think the answer to that question, the basic answer, is the fact that Burroughs was never married and she never had children. And so she didn't have a progeny, if you will. She didn't have a biological heritage in the earth that could literally carry her work forward in the way that we think now, where you have descendants of many, leaders throughout history who have children and grandchildren and a progeny that can kind of carry that work forward. Burroughs didn't have that. And so I think that contributes to why she has been typically overlooked. But then also the way that we think about African-American women in the 20th century, there's room to expand that, right? A lot of times women have been looked at as doers and not necessarily thinkers. And so intellectual history is a particular area in the historical enterprise wherein we are interested in understanding what are the thoughts and ideas that people are wrestling with throughout space and time. There was a question when I was teaching, I used to ask my students, I said, when you think about African descended people, I used to start out the semester with this. I said, when you think about African descended people in the world, what words come to mind? And inevitably they would say, police brutality, slavery, segregation, all of the pathologies associated with Blackness. And we would put these words on a board and create a digital word cloud, if you will. And I said, what's the one word that's not up here? And they'd be like, I don't know, we said everything, right? Nobody could think about what is it that we didn't say. And I said, the one word that nobody said is thinker, which lets me know that when you think about who and what African descended people have been to the world and what we have meant to history, the word thinker doesn't come to mind, which means that the way in which we think about African descended people has been narrowed to a very particular genre, to a very particular type. And so when you look at someone like Burroughs, who spent a lot of her life not only building institutions, but educating, right? And writing and thinking. So, the fact that we are now understanding that we have to expand the genre and expand how we think about African descended people, I think speaks to why Burroughs in some respects has been also overlooked. So the first, not having any children, never having been married and having that aspect of her life, but then also the fact that traditionally, when you look at historiography and the way that history has been written, locating African descended people in the narrative as thinkers has not always been the rule. So I think I know that was a long way to answer it, but all of those forces together, I think, contribute to why she has not been as prominent in our thinking as she probably should be.
And is the fact that she was a woman, does that contribute even more to that?
I think so. You have sort of this great man view of history. And so even now, scholars are excavating. It's almost like an archaeological endeavor. And when I was writing the book, that's how I approached it, almost as an archaeologist who's carving through all of the rocks in history to try to understand who and what this person did. And so certainly the fact that she was a woman contributed to why a lot of her contribution may not have been recognized in the way that we see some of the other more well-known names, like, again, Du Bois or Garvey or Booker T. Washington, et cetera. So that's certainly a contributing factor as well.
I am really interested in which text of Burroughs' work you included in this book. Where and how did you find them? Are these all of her published and unpublished writings? And how did you decide to organize them in the book?
Yeah, well, it's certainly not all of her published writings. Again, she lived a very long life and was widely applied across a variety of different areas. Her archive at the Library of Congress has over 100,000 items in it. And, when you think about that, I don't even think I have like 100,000 things in my house, right? So the fact that she's able to produce, content where the volume is over 100,000 items is just remarkable. But I approached it really through a, not to sound overly scientific, but in a qualitative research methodological approach. I kind of looked at, I started doing the research and was just grabbing various pieces of writings that I thought really highlighted various aspects of her mind. And so what I did was kind of lay these out literally like on the floor and started to draw lines of continuity between the different pieces. And then the way in which I organize them, that's how those categories emerge, by really drawing, okay, what is the common thread between, this particular piece and this piece. And so I really did take a qualitative methodological approach to it in terms of looking at the vast volume.
In your introduction, you discuss Burroughs' ideal for true womanhood. How did this influence her role as an activist for women's rights?
Right. So the era in which Burroughs is operating, the era in which much of her work is manifested, is a world in which there are separate spheres for men and women. And so women were expected to be in the domestic sphere, while the public sphere was seen as the domain of man, if you will. And so Burroughs really expanded, sought to, even through her life and work, to expand that definition of how women could be applied in various areas, that women were not merely confined to the domestic sphere, but in fact had a right to the public domain and ought to use that domain to advance women's initiatives. And I use the term women's initiatives in particular because sometimes, depending on the environment, the term women's rights may carry certain contemporary ideas that may not have applied during Burroughs' time. And so she did commit her life to women's initiatives and helping women to, if I can make up a word, entrepreneurialize themselves. She was very invested in helping women to become entrepreneurs and to helping them to advancing a lot of their self-determination. And so her idea of how women ought to be in the world, how they ought to operate, was very pronounced.
What was Burroughs' position on education, and how would her views have compared with, well, with those of other activists like W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington?
That's a great question. Burroughs had a very robust view of education, and scholars are now beginning to understand that the divide that has been manufactured between Du Bois and Washington is sometimes overly reductionistic. And I say that to say, folks say Booker T. Washington was purely about industrial education, and W.E.B. Du Bois was purely focused on more of the liberal arts types of um, education, which, is not untrue, but the kind of narrow juxtaposition, or the kind of narrow way in which we conceive Du Bois and Washington is now emerging. So I just wanted to put that out there. But Burroughs, again, as I mentioned earlier, she was kind of facetiously called Mrs. Booker T. Washington because she did believe in industrial education and a lot. And so when I say industrial education, you're talking about a lot of what we may associate with like home economics, the domestic type of activities. However, the rationale for that was not that this is the only thing Black people can do, right? The rationale was actually a very intuitive one. If for 400 years you have a group of people who have been confined to a certain type of work, right? So during the period of enslavement, we understand what African Americans were doing. A lot of the domestic, particularly women, a lot of the domestic types of work, as well as you had folks working in the fields, et cetera, working with their hands. So you had folks working in the house, and then those working in the field. And so Burroughs is like, well, look, this is what we have been doing for 400 years. So coming out of this indeed dastardly experience, why don't we take this skill set, right, that has been honed over all of these centuries, and now, if I can use this word again, entrepreneurialize it, right? How do we now take this skill set to create an economic floor for our community? And so her philosophy of education, in terms of her commitment to industrial education, if you think about it from that perspective, makes sense. But also, similar to W.E.B. Du Bois and Carter G. Woodson, she saw this need to expand the life of the mind. So not only expanding how one's hands were applied in terms of work, but also expanding the life of the mind. And understanding that African descended people, particularly African Americans in the United States, needed Black history, that they needed exemplars and curricula that was developed based on our own historical experience. And so she had a very unique and robust view of education. She thought that, women not only needed, she started the National Training School, founded the National Training School for Women and Girls, but that women and girls not only needed to understand how to use their hands to enrich themselves, to be able to generate income and revenue for their lives and for their family, but she was also interested in ensuring that Black women knew how to use their minds, how to think big, right? How to generate big thoughts, and how to use their mind to envision new futures for the race.
What is one misconception people might have about Burroughs that you would want to see corrected?
I think I'll answer that question by articulating about how Burroughs saw herself. Out of all of the monikers that we assign to Dr. Burroughs, she simply wanted to be known in her life as a good Christian woman, right? So although in the book I talk about her as a thinker, as an intellectual, all of these great and monikers and designations, Burroughs simply wanted to be known as a good Christian. I think something that people don't know about is how incredibly self-effacing She was. She never owned the school that she founded. She said, "Why would I own it? It's not my work. It belongs to God." And so, really, that was her methodology throughout her life. And so, I think what should be remembered about Burroughs is how she would have wanted to be remembered was just simply being a good Christian, doing her duty as a Christian ought, one who sought to apply her life to expand the narrative and to expand the territory for the race. People during that era, when they were committed to race work, in the mid 20th century, we may call them civil rights leaders or civil rights activists, but during Burroughs' time, these folks designated themselves as race men and women. And so that's really how she saw herself as an educational evangelist, as a race woman, and one who simply sought to do her duty as a Christian ought.
Wonderful. Who would you like to read Nannie Helen Burroughs and why?
This work is appropriate for all audiences, not only for scholars and those who have a very targeted interest in the African American historical experience or African American intellectual history, but also those who are interested in understanding how African American lived and thought during this period in history, and the various initiatives and innovations that they generated through their lives. And so I think that many would find a comfortable place with this particular work.
Right. Definitely a broad audience for it.
Yeah.
What is your favorite story that you've heard about Burroughs that you'd like to share?
I am so glad that you asked me that question. Favorite story: Nannie Helen Burroughs, as I mentioned at the top of this interview, was the descendant of formerly enslaved heritage, if you will. And her grandmother's name was Maria Poindexter. And Maria was a formerly enslaved woman. And so when Nannie was growing up, she would tell her this story. She said, the master used to look at me and say, "Maria, why are you not looking down at the ground?" And Maria would say, "Look down at the ground. For what? I'm not a hog, if you will. I'm a child of God. I hold my head up because that's what God made me for." She used to tell Nannie, "We ain't no hung down head race child. We pull, but we proud, right? We are poor, but we're proud." And so really what her grandmother was doing was implanting a mindset in Nannie. And that mindset said, despite our existential condition, right? Despite the change, despite the brutality and all of that, you are not confined to this existence. But in fact, you can be more because you come from a people who are more, right? You come from a people who have not narrowed themselves to what the existential context suggests they are. And so that is my favorite story, and I include that story in the book. That's my favorite story about Burroughs, because really Burroughs, in fact, called her grandmother a seamstress and a philosopher. And it was precisely because despite her grandmother's condition of being an formerly enslaved woman, right, her mind, her brain wasn't confined to that experience.
Unfortunately, we're coming to the end of our time. I wonder if you have any brief closing comments about how your book should matter to readers today and for readers in the future.
Yeah, thank you for that question. The wisdom that can be found in this work, the wisdom that resided in Nannie Helen Burroughs' mind certainly has implications for our world today. And so I think that despite the fact that many of these pieces were written, over a century ago in some cases, that they still have significance for our world today. So those would be my parting words for readers.
Well, I want to thank you, Dr. Graves, for participating and being here today and speaking with us. Thank you for your insight. And thank you for your beautiful book, Nannie Helen Burroughs, a documentary portrait of an early civil rights pioneer, 1900 to 1959. It's available now in hardback wherever books are sold. And in July 2022, it will be available in a paperback edition, which we are very excited about. To purchase the book, we encourage you to visit and support your local independent bookstore, either in person or online. Or you can order the book through the Notre Dame Press website at undpress.nd.edu. Take care.